Hello, welcome to this video about transitions. So as I mentioned in the reader expectations video, as we're reading, we're making all kinds of connections. You know, you could leave a letter out of a word and your brain still is able to make sense of it. But like I mentioned, the connections between sentences and between paragraphs are not as straightforward. So the connections that we make in between sentences and between paragraphs are called transitions. And they do a number of things. So number one, they signal to the reader that you're about to shift ideas. They indicate the relationships between two ideas, and they clarify the purpose and structure of your essay. So without these transitions, doing these three things, your essay is going to be very unclear. If you are unable to do this, you're not fulfilling your role as an author. Because it's tricky, you know, your audience only has what's on the page. They can't read your mind because you have ideas, you know, you have reasoning for why you structure the essay the way you do. But if it's not on the page, then your audience might not even make the connections that you're meaning. So I have an analogy to describe this. So if you imagine a wagon wheel, so back to our analogy of getting from point A to point B with your essay, and the central hub is your main idea or thesis, and then you've got all of these supporting ideas around it, your supporting paragraphs. Imagine the rims or the spokes being the transitions between the thesis and the paragraphs, and then the rims being the transitions in between each supporting paragraph. So what happens if, as you're going along throughout your essay, but then you don't make these connections clear, you miss a transition or maybe three, there's a structural unsoundness to your argument. So you're going along, you're talking about your topic, but then you leave out a key point that you're trying to make, or what does this have to do with what came before? Your audience is going to be asking, so what? They don't know what the connections are. They're not going to be able to stay with you. So let's look at how you do this more specifically. So there are specific kinds of words that you can use to make these kind of transitions. I'm not going to read all of them. You can push pause on each of these to look at them more specifically. But their functions are adding or showing sequence, to compare, to contrast or show exception, to give examples or intensify, to indicate place, to indicate time, to show cause or effect, to repeat, summarize, or conclude. And then here's an example of how these would work. So here's a nice example with the transitions words left out. So this is more of a sentence-to-sentence example. So McDonald's is not the best fast food restaurant. Blank. The nice thing about McDonald's is that they have franchises around the world. So the first one is clearly, okay, we know the author does not like McDonald's. But then the next sentence is, wait a second, he's talking about a nice thing about McDonald's. So we need some kind of word in there to buffer, because if you don't have that word, you're losing your audience, because they're saying, your audience is going to say, well, wait a second, you were just saying you didn't like McDonald's. Now you're saying there's a nice thing about them. So we'll add in a however, or on the other hand, something to indicate that you're shifting your position. So blank, when I was in Russia and missed American food, I easily found a McDonald's in Moscow. So we're getting more specific. So we've been talking about, okay, here's a nice thing, and then here's an example to back that up. So that transition word might be something along the lines of, for example, or an instance of this is when I was in, something along those lines. So blank, McDonald's satisfied my cravings while I was, so another example, so an additive one of, in addition to that, or another example. blank Wendy's, which is a better restaurant, is difficult to find abroad. So again, you're shifting your position of, McDonald's is this way, but you're contrasting that with Wendy's. So you're going to have a contrasting word. So however, Wendy's, however, is a little bit bland. You've got a lot of options. You can look at that list. You can just really try to vary your writing. So I'll let you read this and look at it. I'm going to go on to another example. So this is from an essay. This is more the paragraph level transitions. So this is an essay about why pennies should be abolished. So it was a persuasive essay. Here are two paragraphs from that. So the first one talks about a study by Robert Waples of Wake Forest University. How, incidentally, this is a great, a summary of this source. Clearly cited, clearly indicated where it begins and ends. So the study showed that rounding to the nearest 5 cents would not affect consumers. This happens because of how do we introduce this study though? Just think for a second of how you might tie in. I'll show you what this student wrote. So abolishing the use of the penny seems like a good idea, but some are skeptical and think that if pennies were taken out of circulations, stores would round everything up to the nearest 5 cents to maximize profits. So then he gets into this professor showing that, okay, that's not the case. I love this move of transitioning and saying, okay, here's a concern people might have, but here's why it's not true. So without that introductory transition sentence, there's a so what that comes up of what does this have to do with that. But already by adding this sentence, we're answering a question about a concern that people might have, answering a so what, basically. Okay, next one. So the student sits down, plays Monopoly. The first game is with dollar bills. The next game is without them and with rounding. So kind of a personal example to illustrate this point. So this one has a transition sentence leading into this and one leading out. So think to yourself, you might pause, think, okay, how would I get into this paragraph? How would I lead out of this paragraph? Here's what the writer did. So I decided to do a small study of my own to see how rounding prices would affect the purchases I make. So rather than just diving in, because it might be like, what does Monopoly have to do with pennies at all? This introductory or transition-y first sentence is answering that question. And then at the end, this simple example can be likened to the change the U.S. economy would see if pennies were no longer used as legal tender. So I like that move. I think it's a little insufficient, maybe. It's a little bit of a jump going from Monopoly to the U.S. economy. There's a lot of differences. I think that could be done a little bit more cautiously. But I like that move, though, of here's what this example has to do with my essay at large. To see this is a spoke, of here's my paragraph, here's what it has to do with my main idea. So there's a little bit about transitions. Let me know if you have any other questions, and good luck on the wiki post.